All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Friday's version of the ITS seminar. I am very pleased to introduce my friend Dr. Matthew Palm to talk with us about his work on the LA wildfires and mobility challenges. Dr. Matthew Palm is an assistant professor in city and regional planning at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research examines how barriers in transportation systems affect access to essential activities like medical care, school, and work, aiming to help planners design systems that maximize overall public benefit while minimizing unintended harms. He received his PhD from UC Davis. It says in geography, but that's not right. It's geography.
I was originally in TT.
Okay. Well, he's still a UC Davis alum, and he works in transportation now, so we'll claim him as our own. And he's published extensively on transportation topics in the United States and Canada. So without further ado.
All right, hey everyone. Thank you so much for letting me come to. Someone was excited out there. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about mobility challenges during the 2025 Los Angeles wildfires. Where to begin? I'll say I'm not a scholar who was originally interested in wildfires, but I had a lot of lived experience growing up in San Diego. My home burned down neighborhood burned a couple times, and I just guess as a kid thought that was normal, and that happened to everyone's neighborhood. And watching the fires in Los Angeles last year brought all that back, and so I decided to see if there was a way to connect with scholars working in the space to bring the mobility, justice, and equity lens that I bring to my work to issues of evacuation, which is sort of how this came about. And I'm very lucky that the UC Davis collaborator network of UC Davis alums, there's a lot of great folks working on resilience, disaster, and wildfires, including at least one person in the room I can think of. So got to luck out on that and work on these projects. There's two separate projects. One is focused on how transit riders evacuate. And the second one is about vehicle abandonment, specifically in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood. And before I jump into those, I just want to overview the wildfires since it's been over a year now. And there might be folks here or online who aren't familiar with some of the particulars of the fires. So the 2025 LA wildfires were very fast. There were hurricane speed, hurricane force winds in Southern California, red flag conditions that led to very short evacuation windows. Winds were also changing pretty constantly and regularly, and we've heard from research subjects that we've interviewed thinking they're driving away from the fire, but as they're sitting in traffic, the winds have changed. Now they're actually driving towards it. And at the same time, several of the communities that were affected by these fires had pretty severe network bottlenecks. And so here on the right, this is a map of all of the property that was damaged or destroyed in Pacific Palisades. This area at the top is called the Highlands. We'll be talking a bit about the Highlands. There is one arterial in or out. I think it's listed there. You can't see because of the bar, but it's listed as a minor arterial according to Caltrans. There's no other way in or out except for a fire road that is kind of over here. But as our research subjects told us, the fire road itself was on fire and so was not actually helpful in that situation. So the two main fires that you've probably heard the most about are the Palisades fire, which I just showed a map of in the south, and the Eaton fire, which affected Altadena in sort of east of Los Angeles. There was also a third fire that was very relevant to the research I'm going to talk about today that was put out very quickly, and thank goodness it was. It was the Sunset Fire that broke out like just on the Hollywood Hills, and which threatened North Hollywood and West Hollywood. And this is important because those are communities that have very large populations of transit-dependent residents and people who rely on transit to get where they need to go. So these are maps of the evacuation extents of those three fires. And this is a plot from the American Community Survey of the number of zero-car households in each block group. So this is still Los Angeles, and so the percentage of people in these neighborhoods who don't own cars is low relative to global standards compared to in New York City. But within the context of LA, they weren't actually that low, particularly the Sunset Fire in West and North Hollywood, as well as Altadena on the bottom right here. And from an evacuation perspective, it isn't the percentage that matters, it's the number of people who are going to need help getting out. And so the evacuation zone for the Palisades fire did encroach on a part of Santa Monica where there were several thousand zero-car households. Similarly, the Eaton fire encroached on and burned through several communities that had another several thousand zero-car households, and then the Sunset Fire hitting into I would say, one of the more transit-rich parts of the Los Angeles area. And this is significant because while we have had issues and concerns around zero-car household evacuations from wildfires before, so for example, in the Paradise Fire, there was a small town called Concow that had lower income. There were some folks that needed help evacuating there. This is the first time, safe to say, that we've seen a wildfire in California encroach on a major urban area with tens of thousands of people who don't own cars. And so our primary research question in the first project is, how do people evacuate when they don't own cars? Zero-car households are very hard to survey because you can do a random digit dial and there's like a 10% chance the person who picks up, assuming they pick up, which they don't anymore, doesn't own a car. So we took a different tact and we asked the question of focusing on transit riders. How do transit riders evacuate from wildfires? And before I get into the details of that work, I want to acknowledge a very large research team who joined me in this. Maddie Brosen and Sang-Oh Kim at UCLA, Amy Lee here at Davis, Sarah Dennis-Bauer at University of Washington, Tara Goddard and Ryan Miller at Cal Poly SLO. Ryan is here in the room joining us today. Thanks for being here, Ryan. And Sarah Gregdura at Utah State, all but two of whom are UC Davis alumni. So, hey, you came to the right school. This work was funded by the Natural Hazards Center, which is supported by the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. And we also got a wonderful grant from the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, who very generously supported us in this endeavor. This research area, or this project, had three main questions. The first one, as I mentioned, how do transit riders evacuate? We don't know. We didn't really know. There wasn't a lot out there on this. What factors are associated with their mode choice decisions? What's influencing the choices they make? And something related, this was actually funded through a health call. I won't go too much into this part of the work because it's still ongoing, but we looked at how transit riders adapt to wildfire smoke. Because the literature does suggest that transit riders are more exposed to air pollution generally, particularly, mostly waiting at bus stops and whatnot. I'm sure you've maybe had that experience of waiting at a bus stop on the side of a major road and you find yourself coughing and hacking. So we were wondering what happens to, how do people adapt and what strategies do transit riders employ to protect themselves when the air is harder to breathe? So we collected data via a survey. We ran the survey through the transit app. Who here has the transit app on your phone? Okay, great. So for folks maybe online who don't know, this is an app that can be used to check when the buses are coming, but of course, so it's not always right, but it's not bad. And they allowed us to recruit responses through the app. We got 643 valid responses. We ran a banner ad for 2 weeks, and the app sent one push notification in English and in Spanish to several 100,000 users in the LA area. And this was less than a month after the wildfires had been put out. So this was very quick and very fresh in people's minds, which meant we feel good about the reliability of what they told us. Most evacuation surveys do not come out that quick. So we're really grateful to the Natural Hazard Centers and ITSLA for getting us support that quickly. Only 146 of our respondents were evacuees, but among those 146, we did 38 semi-structured interviews to try and understand the broader situation facing transit riders. So I'm going to present results on two questions that we asked in that survey. The first, when we asked our evacuees, what means of travel did you use to evacuate? And because, you know, people who don't own cars are sometimes engaging in, have a repertoire of mobility tools to kind of make up for that deficit, we made an inclusive question so people could select all the modes that they use. It's not mutually exclusive. And then we ran some demographic tests via Fisher tests and analyzed our interviews through a deductive interview guide-based process, which I can talk about for folks doing qualitative work. We didn't want to survey all these non-evacuees and not get a sense of what they were thinking. So we asked those folks a stated preference question. We said, if your home had been in or was in a mandatory evacuation zone, how likely would you be to use each of the following modes to evacuate? And you know, for some of you doing survey work, right, this is tricky and you've got to be careful how you frame it. So you know, mutually exclusive ordered categories. So we asked not at all, somewhat likely, very likely. And for the sake of the modeling I'm going to show you today, we just ran some logistic regressions to pick or to predict whether or not someone said they were very likely to maybe use that mode. So we've got some observed data and we've got some stated preference data, and we'll put those in conversation with each other to try and understand what predicts the likelihood of using the mode to evacuate. Our sample demographics were pretty good as far as an online-based survey goes. So the sample was 30% Hispanic or Latino and about 30% white. That's actually skews a bit whiter than LA Metro's transit ridership. That's partly to do with the demographics of the Pacific Palisades and parts of North Hollywood, but it also could reflect maybe the limitations of the transit app. I will say as a side note, I am on a TCRP project looking at transit survey design, and every agency staffer I've spoke to has nothing but positive things to say about transit app as a method of survey recruitment. So I'll acknowledge these limitations, but I'll say it's very hard to survey transit riders in this country, and transit app is almost as good as it gets. On gender breakdown, we were pretty good, pretty close to LA Metro's own data. About a third of the residents lived in households with children. About 20% were households with older adults. Half of them were households with pets. LA Metro does not ask their riders if they have pets, so I don't know how representative that is, but this is very important for evacuation, you know, because folks do not want to leave their pets behind, and transit agencies have to make a decision if somebody's evacuating. Do you let them bring their pet on the bus? Does Uber let people bring their pets onto Uber? This actually came up in our interviews. 40% of the sample does not access a car. That's also, again, low for LA Metro ridership, so we're skewing more towards drivers. But if I understand correctly, in the hazard survey world, this is the more novel part of our sample is almost half are people that don't own cars. And so I'll start by showing how people evacuated without a car, or how transit riders evacuated. The most common mode of travel, and these, again, are not mutually exclusive. People combine modes. Almost half got a ride, and it says friends here, but a ride with friends, family, neighbors or et cetera was the question. The next two most common modes were walking and taking my own car. And then about a fifth of people took transit as part of their evacuation. And a little less than a fifth took ride hailing. And then there were very small shares of people who biked or who went via car share. And this is interesting for those of us who study mobility equity issues. There's a lot of research on how households without cars access cars through other means, like getting rides from other people and with Uber. And so in a way, this isn't very surprising and it makes a lot of sense. Low-income households will rely on social networks to access cars in normal conditions, and the same thing happened during the evacuation. So I'll show you the results of our Fisher test, where we looked at a breakdown of this between low-income households and non-low-income households. We define low-income household using the California Housing and Community Development's like income threshold, the affordability threshold. The only significant differences were how people that were not low income were far more likely to walk, which I thought was really interesting. Low income households were far more likely to take public transportation, and not low income was more likely to take public transportation. And then low income folks were actually more likely to use their car or get a ride from a friend, which was kind of surprising to me and kind of threw me off a bit. Part of it was if folks had lower incomes and they had a car, that it was just their default, right? They're not going to pay for an Uber when you already have your own car. A lot of people in the sample were in what we call car deficit households, where the ratio, that's a loaded term, but for our transportation audience, but where the ratio of cars to drivers is below zero. And in those contexts, even people in households with cars might have considered Uber and Lyft and walking. I'm going to bring in some of our qualitative research on how those decisions got made and sort of what the impacts were. And some of the themes that came out of our interviews were the uncertainty that's inherent in relying on other people for rides, tension with family members, neighbors, landlords, and also guilt. There's one respondent who said there were points in the middle where I wasn't sure which friend would take me or who was where. I was totally dependent on someone else's decision-making. My favorite. I drove my grandma, yes, in her car, yes. The one time she let me drive it. Yay. And then one final quote on this. I'm asking you to drive into the fires, and that seems like a really scary and awful thing to ask. This is an elderly woman who walked. She did not get a ride. She felt guilty about asking somebody to drive into the fire zone. That's something that also came up around Uber. We had one respondent who said he was LA's #1 Waymo user, and Waymo was not allowed to operate in the fire. And he was very angry that he had to ask a human driver to come pick him up through Uber. And I mean, he had a point. Here's the breakdown by car access. There's really nothing shocking here. People who are in a household that owned a car, far more likely to. But again, your household owns a car, but maybe your partner has the car, is the other side of the city, and you're at home, you're using the other modes. So only 40% of people whose households owned a car actually use that car to evacuate, right? Because these are car deficits. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious on the transit side of things. How disrupted was transit service in the city during the fires?
Well, it depends on who you ask and what part of the city they were in at what time. We have the GTFS RT data, and someday we're going to look at it when I have time. But I mean, there were rapid updates coming minute by minute, and part of it, wasn't just the fire, but it was also the debris and also the smoke.
Yeah.
And they were rerouting, and I guess the short answer is we don't really know, but a lot of we had at least a dozen respondents who described like waiting for the bus to evacuate.
Yeah.
So the 602 ran through Altadena, and we had a few respondents who were like, yeah, I waited for 2 hours for the bus and I didn't get any information. That may have had to do with the cell towers going down because information was coming out by a transit app. That's a great question, though. Last thing I'll look at is disability status. So this is comparing mode choice among people where someone in their household had a disability versus no one in their household had a disability. And folks and households where someone had a disability were far more likely to ride public transportation and to walk. Which that might seem a bit confounding. Well, why would people who have disabilities be more likely to walk? And this came up in some of our interviews, particularly older adults who lived alone. There was one woman who told us, she said, everybody was packed up and ready to go themselves. I called 911 and the 911 operator said they were stretched so thin nobody could help me. So I just started walking down south on the road she took. So there were meaningful number of people who maybe despite having a disability or an impairment were walking because maybe they couldn't make those connections to get those rides out. There are other reasons why people walk, and that's because they saw the traffic and they said, no, thank you. Here's one quote from somebody who lived in West Hollywood. I go on the rooftop, I see the traffic is not moving. It was at a standstill. I said, no way, I trust my life before I trust the Uber or the Metro. I didn't even see Metro out there, and this person ended up walking. Since a fifth of the respondents took ride hailing, this was of interest to a lot of us because again, ride hailing has this role of sort of helping fill mobility gaps among low-income households who don't have a car. And that came with particular benefits and challenges in the context of an evacuation. So one thing that Uber and Lyft did is they offered free rides, and the free rides were anywhere from the evac zone to the evac shelters, which was great if you were trying to get to an evac shelter, but a lot of people did not evacuate to the shelters. One person told us, I saw that Uber and Lyft had free rides to the nearest evacuation center, but I didn't consider that because I just felt safer going to a hotel room with all my valuables and belongings with me. And so for people who were taking Uber to other destinations, we heard some significant number of complaints that it cost twice as much as usual. We talked to people who didn't take Uber because they thought that surge pricing was on, or they assumed that it was on. On the flip side, people who did take ride hailing did report that wait times were not so bad. So one quote, I think I waited a little longer than usual, but because, well, the city was on fire, but it wasn't really extraordinary. And a lot of people did evacuate via ride hailing. This is the area where the pets came up as an issue. One woman almost didn't take an Uber. She was having a backup plan because she wasn't sure if they would let her take her pets. She said sometimes they're like, oh, we don't take pets. This time they did not say anything, so thank God. There's actually some research by our colleague, Tara Goddard, who looked at the Caldor fire in South Lake Tahoe a few years ago, and also the agency there kind of having grace and allowing the evacuees that it was evacuating to bring their pets was really important in getting people to evacuate, getting on the bus quickly and getting people out. So there was no time to argue, so allowing that grace was really helpful. Now I'll show you those logistic regression models, since we're transport people and we love stats, predicting people's stated preference to maybe consider using these modes to evacuate. I'll start with that. No, okay, well, older adults were less likely to say they would consider using ride hailing. These are pretty significant odds ratios. They're relative to people under 35. And so folks over 50, half as likely to say they would consider using ride hailing, which makes sense considering who generally uses ride hailing. Lower income folks were more likely to say they would use public transportation to evacuate than higher income folks. Not surprising, it also corroborates what the actual evacuees did and how the actual evacuees went. One thing we did is for baseline travel behavior, we asked people how many days a week they used each of these modes of travel. We put that in the model. And what we found was the more you used a particular mode in your day-to-day, the more likely you were to say you would evacuate via that mode. So, which kind of makes sense, right? You think about the theory of planned behavior and our perceived behavioral control influencing our choice to do things. The mode that we know that we're comfortable with, that we use a lot, is going to be maybe our default mode for evacuating, and that that was kind of an interesting finding. Before I wrap up this study, I will talk about, we did ask people whether this experience changed their attitudes towards transit and car ownership, and we did get some responses in that regard. One man, he must have been the only zero car household in Pacific Palisades, and somehow we found this guy. It was great. He said, I have a car now, and I don't drive it that much, but I got one because there is some comfort in knowing that I could drive out somewhere. We also heard folks say they did not want to move back to Pacific Palisades because they wanted to live in a neighborhood where they could go in any direction if they needed to. And one more quote on this. The fires changed my perspective a lot. I am more anxious, but any anxiety makes me want to get a car, just knowing that could potentially happen again. So we did find some evidence that maybe this experience might change people's attitudes towards automobile ownership. We also did speak to, and it's not very many, but a couple of people who kind of went the other way, who said, I just saw all these people stuck in gridlock and I was walking past them. So no, I don't feel like I need to own a car. So the impact is kind of heterogeneous in terms of, and this is all interview data, so I'm not speaking with statistical certainty, but maybe I'm planting some hypotheses that someone out there will go answer with other kinds of observed research. Question?
One thing I'm wondering about for the walkers, do you have a sense for how far they walked if they had to, or how far a typical evacuation shelter was for most people?
No, but we could map that because we know where the shelters are and we know where they live. It's a good idea. It's really interesting. Yep.
Okay, this sounds a little bit weird, but I'm from Santa Rosa where we had to do a lot of evacuation.
Yes.
And I know that after the cars, my mom actually got an additional vehicle, which I call her bug out, which is like a giant SUV that she could pack with like the pets and extra stuff. So I was wondering if you've heard like anecdotally or seen anything like that about people getting cars that were big enough to pack things in LA, or if it's just non-car people getting a car.
That's a great question. What did come up was people who are getting rides feeling like because it was someone else's car, they shouldn't be allowed to bring too much stuff because that space should be for that person. But among car owners themselves talking about the size of the car, that hasn't come up. But yeah, does your mom want to be interviewed? That's
Because she normally drives like a little, very like fuel efficient commuter vehicle.
Yeah.
But after that experience, she totally freaked out, got a giant SUV, never drives it except to like keep the engine from falling apart. But it's like her evacuation vehicle.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
That's our next project.
And that's like genuinely fascinating. Before we move on, I do just want to tease a little bit of our results about adaptation to the smoke, which got very, very bad in big parts of LA. So we asked riders, did you do any of the following to protect yourself from smoke exposure? Number one was masking. A vast majority of people did it. Drinking more water to help with the symptoms. A lot of folks did it. About a quarter of the respondents said they avoided riding transit. About a quarter said they avoided traveling during the peak smoke times. So when the smoking was at its worst. And then a similar number of people said they got rides instead of taking the bus. And then smaller shares of people described things like shortening their trips, changing their routes to avoid transfers. There were a couple of people we interviewed who said, I waited an extra hour on the bus so that I didn't have to spend 15 minutes waiting for a transfer. We were talking about transfers earlier, so also relevant. And there were some folks who switched to Uber as a way to kind of minimize their exposure. Maybe easier to wait inside for their Uber instead of standing out at the bus stop. But we've kind of just scratched the surface of that data, and we're starting to go dig into that more later. So I'll just wrap up this part by talking through some of the policy implications that we've had. We had the privilege of presenting the more preliminary version of the results to transit agencies in the area. And through that dialogue, we were able to kind of talk through what what policy implications might look like. And before events, it's really important to tell transit riders not to assume that the bus is coming. The moment this is declared as a mandatory evacuation zone, an agency is not going to want to send a bus right into the flames. They might get called upon to do so. And you may have seen in the news, there were situations where public transit vehicles were used to evacuate aged care facilities and hospitals and whatnot. But the general service does get shut down. And so, people need to know that they probably shouldn't assume that it's coming. And really to recommend that they think they have at least 3 people they can call for a ride, and that this is an important kind of educational message to get out to folks that, because, maybe it's your best friend, but maybe that particular day they're on the other side of town. There's someone else you're going to need. A lot of people got rides from their landlords or building managers, which was interesting. So a lot of people who didn't own cars and maybe lived in an ADU or a basement unit or whatever, ended up just riding with their landlords. And then, of course, during these situations, aggressively communicating service changes, which was happening. And I think as long as people's phones were working, they were able to get some of those messages. And something that I didn't talk about in this talk but came up in our interviews is LA Metro gave free passes to fire affected households. So a 90-day free transit pass for after the period of the wildfires. And people said this made a big difference in being able to get around after the fire. It was helpful for people who maybe they left their car or they all evacuated in one car and another car was left and was no longer usable. This was an important thing. LA Metro actually made transit fare free for everyone for about a 2-week period, and which was also recommended as something to do and something that people appreciated. So that's that first study in a nutshell about how transit riders evacuate. And so it's really a very multimodal story that centers mostly on folks getting rides from others and kind of, or walking and getting Uber. How am I on time?
We've got time, 28, 25 minutes.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll take questions now on this one before we move on to the vehicle one. But
Great. Did you want the first?
No, go ahead.
I was just curious. I'm thinking a lot about, this sort of reflection on Hurricane Katrina too, where they're talking about sort of the same issues around needing to get transit dependent, which are the poorest, least able, maybe don't even have 3 friends they could call for a ride. It seems like we sort of keep coming back to this in a sort of an emergency management transportation context where it's like we reach this decision point that, we know California is vulnerable to wildfires. We know the Southeast is vulnerable to hurricanes and, all sorts of natural disasters elsewhere. But yet it's like, it's on you to get yourself out, poor person. And so I guess I'm just reflecting a little bit on like, is there anything here beyond just sort of saying they need to figure it out that policymakers should be taking from this as far as like using the bus infrastructure they have, repurposing it to get these people out? It might put it in harm's way, but I'm just trying to think about, how can we do a better job since we know this is constantly a problem to like,
that's a great question. I mean, I came in gung ho, like, let's have a plan for how we're going to use the buses.
Yeah, right.
And there were a couple of agencies that did do that. So the Big Blue Bus did set aside some buses for people to evacuate out of Santa Monica, and we actually I never followed up in how much that was used, but I mean, one thing that did come up was, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a certain a health alert thing that like older adults have, right? So like when you fall, you like push the button
Like a
or
life
whatever.
alert. Yeah, yeah.
That some tool like that could be a great way for people to quickly identify, hey, I need a ride out.
Yeah.
Because the 911 calls were getting overwhelmed, and then figuring out who then coordinates that and who does that, and is it the transit agencies? Is it, I don't know, is that a public health thing? But that was an idea that came out as a way for people to communicate when they needed that help.
One follow-up, do you think like I guess prior to these fires, had LA Metro as a service talked to like the county or the city's emergency management agency on some of these things, or do you see them talking more now? I guess that's in my mind, the bridge I'm trying to make here is like, does a transit agency talk to their emergency management agency about these kinds of things?
They do.
Okay.
They do. My understanding is, you know, there's like this secret life that buses have where they're like also serving as like rescue vehicles in random situations. So like an apartment building fire and there's all these people standing around. LA Metro will be asked to go pick everyone up and take them. And so yes, I mean they were in conversation, but I'm imagining that this event probably turbocharged some of those conversations. But I don't know for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is biking a viable option at that evacuation mode? Because you mentioned people walking, but biking is probably faster than walking. And you also have the ability to bring stuff without, so it's hard to don't know that much.
I mean, very few people biked in our sample. That could just be the nature of, I mean, Pacific Palisades is like a giant hill, so ditto Altadena a little hilly. I think the other thing might have been in that particular context, because the smoke was so bad, biking, you're like doing even more breathing. Maybe that's why folks weren't doing it, but it was lower than I thought it would be. I will say that as a motive, yeah.
Okay, so some of these other comments were making me think about the people in care homes, and I was wondering if you knew whether or not in California they have a requirement to evacuate people, because it seems like at least in other states and other disasters, you hear stories where the staff are trying to evacuate people, but it's kind of their own initiative that they're doing that. Maybe sometimes there's not a law, and I was wondering if you knew what that was in California, because that's a large population of people who don't have cars, probably don't have good mobility. If it's like a memory care, they might not have the cognitive ability to figure out they need to push the button. So I wondered if there's like plans for what we do with that.
That's an excellent question. I come at this from the transportation and mobility
Okay.
justice lens, so I actually don't know,
You don't
but that
know.
is an
That's fine.
excellent question. And if Dr. Goddard was here, she would have the answer.
She's on Zoom.
Okay.
Oh, she's on Zoom. We'll have to find a way to unmute her. Okay. Sorry, I also just called her out and maybe she doesn't have an answer. I don't know. But there was another hand in the meantime.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I know you mentioned that like people felt bad about asking Uber drivers or like bus drivers to come get them. I was wondering if you had any like insight on the actual attitudes of drivers, like how willing they were to go into those areas, or
Nobody described a driver being hostile, being negative, being reluctant. It sounded like everyone was willing to do their part, and there were some bus drivers for Foothill Transit that went straight towards a building that was like on fire and got people in that aged care home out and just described it in the news as just being a part of their job. Do you want to add to that?
Just to add to that, we had a meeting with LA Metro and some other folks and county emergency managers, and it was the LA Metro, I think it was one of their operations coordinators said, yeah, some of our drivers did go out and help people and assist people. And she was saying in this meeting, you know, they're not supposed to do that, but we're glad they did. Like, it's not a policy, and it shouldn't ever have to be a policy that you expect the driver to do that. But many drivers, it sounded like, did that of their own choice.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes the agency might be apprehensive because of the, you are allowed to show up. You know, it's okay, it's one thing to like give someone a ride, but it's another thing to like help them get on the bus. Maybe you're not trained in that, maybe they fall, maybe you're making the agency liable, right? So there's all those kinds of issues. Online questions.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. Tara was responding. Care homes and private facilities have a huge gap. Hospitals have emergency plans. What the regulation is a good question. There, a commenter is saying during the CZU fire, Santa Cruz Metro had a bus waiting at Boulder Creek and spent a few days and nights transporting up and down the mountain to Santa Cruz, and they helped get their friends out of San Lorenzo Valley to Santa Cruz. There's a question whether this will be online. It will be after on the ITS website, so we can always point transit agencies in other places to that where they haven't already presented. And then there was a question about survey design, and maybe just this second part of the question I think is more interesting, whether there are lessons or recommendations for designing a similar survey. Look at that.
Pre-test. We accidentally, for the first 20 minutes, the survey was up, sent evacuees to the non-evacuee questions. So pre-test. That's a good, I guess I don't have any good answers except think about the policy question you want to answer. Think about the data you actually need to answer it. Think about all the variables you add, like the minimum number of variables you need to like control for, and that's it. Nothing else. Keep it as short as possible. All right, so I'll move on to the next presentation about vehicle abandonment in the Pacific Palisades. This is also a big collaborative project funded by the NSF, also with Dr. Greg Dura, Miller, Maddie Rosen at UCLA, and Gretchen Bella at UMD, as well as Rio Ojas at RAHO Los Angeles, and a great team of student researchers. And I'll just say, this was also supported in part by INRIX via the Metro Lab data, and it was funded through the NSF RAPID program. So what inspired us to also sort of simultaneously start looking at the vehicle side of things was seeing this on the news. And while this was airing, this particular video, I can't remember what station it was, but the guy who owned this Audi was calling in, and he had already called in and was talking with someone, and then they showed it, and he was like, oh wait, that's my car you're showing. Which is just like wild. And this was a big problem because we were hearing from the news reports that the agencies were having trouble getting fire trucks up the highlands because there were all these abandoned cars in the way. And there was some famous actor went on the radio and was like, everyone leave your keys when you run from your cars. And not everyone did. I don't know who would you leave your car keys? Like, so lot to think about there. So we said, okay, this is really urgent because this is actually not the first fire this has happened in, not the first fire this has happened in recently. This happened in Lahaina in the Maui fire. This happened in Paradise in the Camp Fire. And now here it was so bad that they had to pull out bulldozers to try and move stuff. So the questions we wanted to ask ourselves is, where do people abandon their vehicles during fast-moving wildfires? Why do people abandon their vehicles? And what factors can we use to predict this? There are many different pieces to this study. I'm going to focus mostly on the qualitative component, but we got trip trajectory data and OD trip data from INRIX. That's the data from connected vehicles, right? So when you're accessing GPS, your car is also, telling Big Brother where you are, and we were asking Big Brother for their data, and we got it. So, sorry, that was too editorial. We also conducted 34 semi-structured interviews with residents, about half of whom actually abandoned their car and half of whom maybe didn't, but saw it or were evacuating around the same time, who we recruited mostly through emails to neighborhood organizations and groups like Palisades Strong. We're very grateful for their willingness to talk to us. There was somebody who used a Google Street View car and went into the neighborhood the day after the initial evacuation. And so on Google Street View right now, you can actually see a lot of the abandoned vehicles. We pulled that data. We also got administrative records from the California Highway Patrol, satellite imagery, and dispatch logs. This has been way more of a forensics exercise than any research project I've ever done. It's been a lot of work of trying to repiece together who and was where, doing what. But we do have strong confirmation from that Google Street View data of vehicle abandonment, although because it was a day later, we don't know if this is actually the state that the cars were abandoned in. So here on the top two panels, this is Palisades Drive. There's a bunch of condos right along the side of Palisades Drive going up to the Highlands. So remember when I mentioned at the start of this talk, there was that one area that there's only one way in or out, that's the Highlands. And that way in or out is Palisades Drive. And at one point, it was blocked off with abandoned cars, which was a problem. And it's of course not a coincidence that the one bottleneck in or out is also the place where traffic got so bad people abandoned their cars, right? And we haven't been able to because we found that someone, we don't know who they were, but someone in some kind of uniform was walking up Palisades Drive telling people, please pull your car over, please pull it onto the sidewalk, please leave your key in the car, please walk. But then other people were coming up later to cars that had been abandoned and were moving them. So in these pictures here, I don't know if this is how the original driver parked, or if someone came and did this. I will say this is an excellent sidewalk parking. And I kind of say that seriously because I think something that we've all learned coming out of this is like, we need to actually teach people to maybe do this and figure out a safe way to do this when traffic gets so bad that folks need to get out of their cars. Most of the cars on Palisades Drive didn't burn. The viral images of the bulldozer were from another part of the network, Sunset Boulevard, right before Palisades Drive. So all this traffic coming down Sunset, all this traffic coming down Palisades, right where they met. And some of those cars did burn, and that's what you see in the bottom panel here. These were cars that clearly had been pushed aside by the bulldozer and then burned later. So the fire did actually come around and after the bulldozing, burn a bunch of these vehicles. So what I want to overview is from the voices of folks who abandoned their vehicles, why, what was going on, what were they experiencing, what was the thought process, and what were the cues that led someone to say, okay, we need to do this. And the first, this is preliminary work. My colleagues and I have only just now started dipping into this data. We're actually still conducting interviews this and next week. So I just want to preface it with that. But one thing that has come through is this belief that there's no way out. So there was one man we interviewed who said, we started to go down Pacific Coast Highway. It was gridlocked. There was fire and smoke. So we headed back towards Sunset. But then you look on WhatsApp texts and everybody's saying it's going to take 3 hours. So we flipped around again and headed back towards PCH. 20 or 30 minutes later, we're not getting anywhere. So we flipped around again on Sunset. And we are basically just stalling in traffic. And we said, you know what? Let's just pull the vehicle over. So perspective that in all directions, it was going to take too long. And there's a point at which walking is just very clearly the fastest way to get out. The next biggest factor was the presence of fire around people and where they are. So this is from somebody who was stuck on Palisades Drive, who said, as I sat there, the ridge went up in flames. I watched the flames jump my car, light the other side on fire, and then the palm trees in the median caught fire. The delivery truck behind me that was already abandoned, it exploded. And that was the point when I ended up popping the median, pulling a U-turn. I went up the hill and I parked onto the curb. This is a big catalyst. Obviously, by the time people they feel that the fire is upon them and making the decision that it's actually safer to walk. This is some video that was provided to us by a participant of one of the cars that was on fire. And you can see the palms as well. You may note, you may not necessarily want to get out of your car, but maybe the people ahead of you already did, and their cars are now in the way, and that might change your calculus. So there was someone who said this was the reason why she got out of her car. She said the fire was right behind us. The people in front of me saw the fire, and they decided the best choice was to leave the car because the flames were pretty close. I could see the flames, I could see that they were close, and no matter what I thought, the people in front of me in both lanes of traffic had already abandoned their cars. So this is why, it's really important for us to think about what protocols you might develop to educate people about what to do in these situations, because the choice I'm making is influencing everyone behind me on them. And I'll just show you another clip. Again, this is the palm trees lighting on fire, which motivated a sizable number of people. You can see at this point, the other side of Palisades Drive, people were already driving contraflow. So very early on, people took over the other side of the road to go down. Here you see fire trucks are encountering drivers who are coming down the direction going up. The next biggest factor was actually authorities encouraging people to get out of their cars. There's one woman who told us, I saw that there was no way I was evacuating because everybody was on that road and that road was blocked. And the fire guy was right there. I said to him, listen, I'm going to be stuck here. I'm never going to get out of my vehicle. What do you suppose I do? He said, I suppose you walk. Go pull your car on the grass. I said, okay. So I pulled my car onto the grass. That was a kind of the way the authority interaction was described on Palisades Drive, of somebody kind of suggesting it, encouraging it, whereas on Sunset, there was somebody with a bullhorn knocking on people's windows going, hey, the fire is here, just get out. And so in this particular instance, the authorities played a big role in when this happened. I am going to say, though, this is all mostly just focused on two areas where we know vehicle abandonment happened for sure, and where it was covered in the media. But depending on how you define abandonment, from the INRIX data, we're starting to see that maybe there was much more abandonment of vehicles, or maybe not abandoned, but cars strategically left behind than we thought. So when we look at the INRIX trajectories of vehicles in this area, we asked what percentage of these vehicles made it out by midnight, made it out of the fire zone, made it out of the evacuation zone. And it was a majority, but it was just slightly less than 55%. So half of all the cars with a signature in the evac zone actually left by the end of the night, even though mandatory evacuation orders had been in place at that point for almost half a day. And a wonderful student we had working for us at Utah State made this figure. So this is the counts of vehicles by hour, by half hour of when they maybe first started driving after the fire. And red is indicating the share of those cars that did not successfully evacuate. So that, which we're defining as the car was still in the evac zone by midnight on the 7th. And green is they successfully got outside of the evac zone by midnight. And there's a big spike right in the first hour, hour and a half after the fire had broken out. The police report, after action reports, and the fire started at 10:23 a.m. That was the first time it was called. Several of the people we interviewed lived on Lockman Lane, which is where the fire started, and they corroborated that with us, which was really helpful. Thank you. And within those first 2 hours, that mass flow of people, that's when the slowdown was. Thus, that's where the abandonment was. And eventually later on, you saw more cars getting out as a share of all the cars that were moving or starting their trips. And we actually had several interviews where people described trying to drive down the Highlands Hill, seeing the traffic and just turning around, going back up, waiting, not knowing if that was the right move or not. And then 3 hours later, they got out in like 15 minutes, perfectly fine. Because the fire didn't actually totally burn through all of the Highlands. So there were people who made the choice just to stay in a place they thought was relatively safe for the Highlands and managed to get out very quickly later. So there was way more. There were even people who they abandoned their car on Palisades Drive and then got in someone else's car to go back up because they were stuck and they couldn't get out because people around them had abandoned, but they had realized I should actually wait this out. We also spoke to families who would meet up to carpool at specific neighborhoods and then take one car out. And then they would leave their cars behind. We also heard of people parking on side streets when they basically gave up sitting on Sunset and they said, you know what, I'm gonna walk. But maybe because it didn't feel like a particular emergency at that moment, they were willing to go pull to find a side street and then walk the rest of the way. We also spoke to a few folks who decided, you know, my car has the best chance of making it if I park in this one parking lot that's pretty far from anything. It's so big that if I park in the middle, it's not gonna burn. I think it was the parking lot for, I'm looking at my colleague, but there's too many interviews, I can't remember which. Anyways, there's several large parking lots where people just dropped their cars off and walked. And this was, you know, I don't know if abandoned is the right word to describe it, but sort of strategically leaving your car behind so that you could walk out safely and under the assumption you could walk back and pick it up maybe later. For the 45% of trips that did not, or vehicles that did not make it out, this is their distribution spatially in an area that we as a research team have sort of defined as a high risk part of the evac zone. And just for reference, where my cursor is, this is all those vehicles abandoned on Palisades Drive that I showed you the street view images of. This is that mass abandonment on Sunset where the bulldozer was used. But you can also see there were bits of abandonment all over along the major roads, along side streets. This is the
Palisades Village.
Palisades Village, which is a big shopping center, lots of parking. This is the Bel Air Club, I think is right around here. Yeah, so we're starting to think that, which is significant because if only half of the cars got out, but the half getting out caused that much traffic, right? You can imagine if all of those cars were still on the road trying to get out, how much worse this might have been and sort of the limits of mass evacuation when you've built communities into the hillside that have only one or two roads going in and out. So, you know, just spitballing some different ways to think about this. This work is very preliminary. You had spontaneous abandonment. You had people getting out of their cars in the middle of the road because it felt urgent, because a firefighter was saying it's time to do this. But you also had tactical abandonment where, you know, people were pulling into certain places, taking refuge, leaving their car somewhere they felt was safe and then walking. And the question that we're kind of left with is, you know, both of these are protective actions. These are protective actions that people took. How can we help people better prepare? I mean, of course, there's the planning question of how do we plan communities where this doesn't happen? And I'm a planning professor and I'm committed to that. But part of what this research is thinking about, you know, what can we do to help in these situations, prepare people to, especially for their safety and also so that first responders can move in as people are moving out. And I'll show you the bigger picture, all the successful evacuations, a lot of the people leaving Pacific Palisades, their initial stops out of the evac zone, the big clusters in Santa Monica, some of these green clusters here, these are places where people would meet up with others, family members from across the region. There's hotels here, so there's quite a bit. And I actually want to, before wrapping up, share with you the perspectives of people who did not get out of their cars. Because we did speak to people who saw the person, who maybe saw somebody a few cars up abandon their car and said, I'm not doing that, I'm gonna wait, and waited, and then eventually drove out. And so these were some of the motivating factors to stay in the car. The first was dependence and pets. One woman told us, I just saw people abandoning cars. They were not leaving their keys in the car. They were leaving on foot. And I just remember I was like handling a bunch of phone calls. I had a baby in the back. I had a cat in the back. I cannot get out. So folks with dependents, folks with pets, maybe folks concerned that their pets would not be able to be behave well, like evacuating on foot and whatnot. Also just, you know, am I carrying the baby? Am I pushing the stroller? If I'm pushing the stroller, I'm leaving all the family's documents behind. I'm not taking both. I can't take both. And this was a big kind of pull factor to keep people in their cars. Authorities also played a role in keeping a lot of people in their cars. One woman said, I was just about ready to get out of the car when a firefighter came by and said, it's going to get shitty, but we will get you out of here. If it wasn't for that, I literally would have ditched the car with the dog and started walking down to the sunset. So this was interesting to me, and unfortunately, we can't figure out which authority, where and when, but there were different times people were getting different signals. There were also a lot of folks who an authority said nothing to them, but because they were sitting next to a fire truck, they felt safe. And they were like, I don't need to get out. I don't need to abandon my car. I'm right next to a fire truck. If my car catches on fire, I'll just go sit in the fire truck. I'll be okay, right? Which was a kind of interesting component that came out of this. Another component was debris and air quality. There was somebody who said, the wind is sending branches. These big branches are hitting the side of my car. I've never experienced anything like that. The branches themselves weren't on fire. There were separate embers, and it just felt like it didn't feel safe to get out of the car. And so my instinct was to actually stay in the car and figure out some way to get the heck out of town. Folks with, respiratory conditions saying, better for my health to sit in the car. Folks concerned about direct exposure to fire while walking. And the last factor, before we wrap up, is age and relatedly disability. And here's one respondent who said, I could have walked, but my husband has some walking issues. He walks with a cane. There was no way he could walk out. I saw that the cars were so backed up, even on Sunset Boulevard, and I was sure Pacific Coast Highway was as well. You'd have to walk several miles. There was no way my husband could do that. So there were folks who stayed in their cars because walking was not an option. And so in sum, a lot of those major deterrents are dependents, pets, valuables in the car, the risks of traveling on foot, as well as any other sort of difficulties around walking. Which kind of had me thinking it's interesting, if you do everything CAL FIRE encourages you to do for packing, your car is a big incentive to stay, right? Because you've got all the important things in there, So these are some preliminary recommendations. We would actually love your thoughts and engagement on this, because we are just starting to think through the many conversations that we've had with people in the Pacific Palisades. A wonderful, beautiful, and very unique community. It has been such a privilege to talk to people who lived in this community. I mean, it wasn't a positive thing to be talking about, but there's artists, there's filmmakers, it's just a wonderful group of folks, and I'm so hopeful for the rebuilding. For the recommendation that we got from these conversations so far, preliminarily, is we do need to think about how to incorporate vehicle abandonment guidance into evacuation education. We need to think about the operational thresholds that might trigger abandonment as a recommendation. I wasn't there, and we haven't had a chance to talk to the authorities, but from the perspective of the people we interviewed, the orders were given kind of spontaneously and kind of inconsistently. So there's a question of, what are the thresholds that should lead firefighters to make this call. Another thing that will be useful is to pre-identify locations for people to stage their vehicles if the roads get too crowded. So thinking about, the big parking lot that's on the way out of town, if it's too crowded, telling as many people as you can, park there, walk the rest of the way, you can come get your car back when the risk is gone. Thinking about providing training for first responders and on what these protocols are, and developing procedures for post-event vehicle recovery and clearance. I didn't go into this, but There's a whole other side of the city then towing these cars out and trying to find the owners trying to find the cars, and there's a need for a lot of guidance around that as well. I'm also interested if anyone has an idea for a catchy slogan about leaving your keys. We got to figure that one out. And you'd be surprised, we spoke to a few people who left their keys in the car, but they hadn't heard that message yet. They just spontaneously, it was all older adult women, which I thought was interesting. Who were like, yeah, I left my keys and I didn't even know I was supposed to do that, but it kind of made sense, in case something happened. And so there's a way to maybe communicate that and make that a part of something that we educate people on. Because it really made a difference and will make a difference in allowing fire trucks to get back up. I realized that was a lot. Thank you all so much for your time, and down for more questions. Go ahead.
This might be going a little bit aside from your main presentation. Have you spoke with car manufacturers to see if they'd be willing to implement some kind of information delivery system? I mean, a lot of these cars, even my car no longer my car, but it's 5 years old now. It receives information from the internet, including map updates, emergency notifications, warnings, etc. If these drivers have that access to that same kind of information right there, then they might know where to go. But that system is handled by the car manufacturers themselves.
Yeah, so one thing I will say, people did the best they could to figure out routing. There was one respondent who called her girlfriend or her boyfriend in Europe, and he went on Google Maps and was like, oh, don't go that way on Sunset, go the other way. It looks like it's less trafficy, and she was able to avoid all the traffic because at that particular moment that route was out. So yeah, a way for cars in real time to let people know what's going on, what's ahead of them would be really helpful. It's an interesting point. Really great. Go ahead.
Okay, so also I know that it's fire time for me, we got the emergency notifications on our phone. So a notification about car abandonment procedures and leaving the keys. If the sheriff or whoever is sending those notifications out in that area incorporates that into their message, people will get it. We got those messages on our phones. And the other thing I would say is in this case, if people could maybe not abandon their cars, one potential use for the car is living it, at least temporarily. That was something my mom was thinking, because when we evacuated, we ended up with 11 people at my cousin's house. Me, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, neighbors were coming over, and people just were packing in. And it does start to feel weird to infringe on other people's spaces, but hotels were full, shelters were full, and a big car can give people a place to sleep for a couple nights. Even if your house isn't burned, if you can't go into your house, you still need someone to stay, somewhere to stay. And
no, I appreciate you
sleep in a car.
bringing that up. Our colleague, Dr. Braydura, has done work on people living in their cars after disasters. And that isn't something to think about. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Was there any attempt at staggering the emergency evacuation notification? Is that even possible to do and have it be effective, just so that people aren't all leaving at the same time? Or is it just now everyone's on next door, and so one person gets a notification and then now everyone is?
I'm not aware of it happening in Palisades. I did happen in Paradise, or was supposed to.
It was supposed to, but I think in Palisades, the fire just moved so fast that the fire moved ahead of the evacuations and everybody was evacuating at the same time anyway.
And the impression from the residents we heard from in Palisades was similarly that the fire was moving so much faster than the orders could go out. But that is something people have been thinking about and trying. Yeah.
Tara Goddard online says these are great questions to ask folks in the wireless emergency alert field.
These are great questions to ask somebody in the wireless alert field. Thank you, Dr. Goddard. Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago, this would have been during our hurricane for, I don't remember which one, but it was in South Carolina, and I had a teacher who was talking about his daughter was trying to figure out, whether it made sense to evacuate, even if it's in the middle of the evacuation zone, because she was like, if there's too much traffic, then my car's, even if I fill it up right before I leave, my car's gonna run out of gas. I don't know, I think this is like a smaller range, so maybe that's not typical, but what, did that come up, like, pulling about gas?
I interviewed a couple of people who got out of their cars, walked down to the base of the hill, filled up a thing with gas, and then walked back on to fulfill their car. And the car traffic hadn't moved, so they were able to.
I was curious, like this was the first fire I was aware of where watch duty became a really big part of it. So everyone was sort of interacting with the fires across LA in a very different way where they're seeing them in real time on these apps. And I was just curious if that was another way that you guys could push information out, given just the number of people who were using it to track the fires.
That is something that participants had recommended to us.
Okay.
They all had
Everyone had watch duty,
Yeah,
yeah.
everyone who's on, not everyone, but like 90%, yeah.
How did the evacuees actually, what was the primary source of information for evacuation?
We did not ask that of the Palisades folks, so I don't know. That's a good question.
What was the question?
It was, what were people's primary source of information?
During the evacuation or before or after?
Just from having done interviews, so this is not like a quantitative statement, but I think the plurality of people just saw smoke or like it was already happening before they even got a notice. And so I think it was just, they observed it, they got in their car and left.
So it's more of a knee-jerk reaction than informed movement.
Yeah, but also necessary, right? Like the
Oh, of
fire
course,
was
of course.
just moving ahead of the orders.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say most people that I listened to the interview for, they saw it or they smelled it before.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no other questions, let's give Matt one more round of applause.
Thank you for all the collaborators. You're amazing. That was wonderful. Thanks.
All right, thanks again. We'll see you next week for Executive Director Tanisha Taylor of the CTC.